My name is Dr. Vivian Mercer. I'm 45 years old. That sentence sounds cleaner than the truth ever felt. People imagine that the moment a life splits in two should arrive with violence. A slammed door, a scream in the middle of the night, a piece of glass breaking on tile while somebody finally says the unforgivable thing out loud. But real disaster is rarely theatrical at first. Sometimes it enters quietly. Sometimes it puts on gloves. Sometimes it smiles at you across a dinner table, asks whether you'll be home before 8, and kisses your forehead before it leaves the room. The day my life divided into a before and an after, I did not know it yet. It was my birthday, not the kind people dramatize. No surprise party, no champagne, no meaningful speech waiting in a velvet box. Just a weekday in Boston, gray and disciplined, the sky over the city the color of old steel. I woke before dawn the way I always did, my body trained by 2 decades of surgical practice to rise before alarms, before excuses, before the rest of the world decided whether it intended to function. The kitchen was dark except for the under-cabinet light over the counter. The coffee machine hissed. The radiator clicked. Upstairs, the house was still quiet. My husband, Richard Mercer, was asleep in our bedroom, likely sprawled diagonally across the mattress the way he always slept when he was deeply comfortable with himself. There was something infuriating, in hindsight, about how peacefully deceit can sleep. Back then, I would have said something kinder. I would have said he had a commanding presence, a confident stillness, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He had spent years as a hospital administrator, building a reputation for calm leadership, strategic vision, and the sort of polished charm that made donors trust him and younger staff admire him. He knew exactly which hands to shake, exactly which faces to remember, exactly how to make people feel chosen. When I met him, I was 34 and already an attending surgeon at a major teaching hospital. I had earned my place the difficult way, with sleepless nights, impossible rotations, and the kind of relentless discipline that rewires your personality until excellence is no longer an aspiration, but a reflex. I had spent years dating men who admired me in theory and resented me in practice. Men who said they loved ambition until it belonged to the woman sitting across from them. Men who liked telling people they were with a surgeon, but quietly punished me for the time, the authority, the self-possession that came with becoming one. Richard felt different. He never flinched at my schedule, never sulked over canceled dinners, never asked me to soften myself so he could feel taller by comparison. He looked at my life, my hours, my achievements, the intensity of my work, and he seemed not only to accept it, but to admire it. At the time, that felt like maturity. It felt like safety. It felt like enough. He had a son from his first marriage, Derek Mercer, 21 when I met him, already in his 3rd year of medical school, and speaking with the overconfident certainty of young men who have not yet discovered the distance between intelligence and competence. He was handsome in a conventional way, sharp-featured, well-groomed, eager to project confidence. He liked saying things in a tone that suggested he was already on the verge of greatness. At family dinners, he spoke about healthcare systems, hospital inefficiency, surgical innovation, and the future he assumed would make room for him because he had decided it should. I remember watching him back then and thinking he was arrogant, yes, but salvageably so. Young. Untempered. Still becoming. I told myself I could live with that. When Richard and I married 2 years later, Derek stood beside his father in the wedding photos with that same camera-ready smile. I was 36 then, old enough to know that perfect lives do not exist, and foolish enough to think I had found something close to durable. I believed I was gaining not just a husband, but a family, a structure, a future. In surgery, we are trained to trust systems when they are functioning correctly. Blood flow, oxygenation, sterility, timing. Every healthy outcome depends on invisible coordination. If one part of the system lies to the rest, the whole body pays for it. At the time, I thought my life was a healthy system. I did not understand I had already been stitched into something diseased. The first sign came 3 years into the marriage. A routine quality assurance review. Nothing dramatic. A long conference table, stale coffee, fluorescent lights, too many spreadsheets, too many people pretending administrative fatigue counted as insight. I was reviewing surgical logs when I saw a procedure attributed to me that I had not performed. Routine appendectomy. Nothing flashy, but the date stopped me cold. I had been in Chicago that week for a trauma symposium. I remembered the hotel. I remembered the panel. I remembered calling Richard from the airport because my connecting flight was delayed, and he joked that even medicine couldn't bully the weather into cooperation. I flagged the record. Someone apologized. A clerical correction was made. And because I was tired, because hospitals are chaotic organisms sustained partly by competence and partly by institutional improvisation, I let it go. That was my first mistake. The second sign came a year later. A patient's family contacted my office asking about postoperative complications from a surgery I supposedly performed. I had no memory of the patient's name, no memory of the consultation, no memory of the procedure. That happens sometimes in medicine, of course. Not every chart glows in your memory forever. Not every face lingers. But when I checked the date, I felt that cold, precise inner stillness that comes before a crisis. I had been in Portugal. Vacation. 9 days. I still had the photographs on my phone. Blue water, white stone, a glass of wine on a hotel terrace. Richard smiling at me from across a table, as though our life was something enviable and clean. The surgery had been logged under my credentials. Again, another explanation arrived quickly. Another correction. Another smooth institutional shrug. This time, I did not forget. I started paying attention in ways no one around me noticed. Surgeons are observant by necessity. We notice tremors, color changes, minor deviations in tissue texture, shifts in respiration so slight they escape everyone else in the room. We are trained to catch disaster before it becomes visible, so I began to watch. Passwords, chart access histories, administrative irregularities. The careless confidence of people who assume the person they are deceiving is too busy to look closely. And then came the third sign, the one that made ignorance impossible. A malpractice attorney called my office on a Tuesday afternoon. The patient had died following a spinal surgery performed under my name. The family was suing. I still remember the way the light looked in my office when he said it. Late afternoon, pale and clinical, flattening everything into hard edges. I remember the file in my hand. I remember the pulse behind my right eye. I remember thinking, with absolute certainty, that there had to be some mistake so severe it bordered on absurdity. Then I pulled the records. The surgery had taken place while I was in the middle of a 12-hour cardiac procedure in another wing of the hospital. Not at lunch. Not before. Not after. During. Timed.
Documented. Unavoidable.
Someone had operated under my license while I was physically elsewhere, inside the same institution. That was the moment the ground shifted. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough for everything I thought I knew to become unstable. For a long time, people asked me later whether I panicked. Number. Panic is for uncertainty without training. Panic is what happens when the body outruns the mind. I am a surgeon. When something catastrophic is revealed, I do not scream. I assess. I closed my office door. I reviewed every page twice. Then 3 times, I cross-checked time logs, OR schedules, access records, chart signatures. The deeper I went, the colder I became. It was not one anomaly, not 2. It was a pattern.
A design.
A hand moving behind curtains I had never thought to pull back. That night, Richard asked whether I wanted to go out for my birthday dinner or stay in. I looked at him across the kitchen island while he loosened his tie and poured himself mineral water as if he were a man returning from a respectable day's work. His expression was easy, affectionate, lightly distracted. The expression of someone who believed the machinery around him was still under control. For one reckless second, I almost asked him directly. Almost. Did you do this? Did you use me? Did you think I would never find out? But confrontation without preparation is just ego wearing the costume of courage. So I smiled. I said I was tired. I said staying home sounded better. He kissed my cheek and told me he'd order from that Italian place I liked. Upstairs, I heard him on the phone later that night, speaking in a low voice behind his study door. I could not make out the words, only the rhythm, brief, clipped, controlled. At the time, I did not know whether he was speaking to Derek. I know now. Over the next several weeks, I told no one, not my colleagues, not hospital leadership, not the police, not even the attorney who kept calling for updates. I needed facts before I made a move. In surgery, you do not open a body until you understand the anatomy beneath the skin. Go in blind, and you can kill the patient trying to save her. My marriage had just become a body full of hidden damage, and somewhere inside it, something malignant was spreading under my name. I intended to find it.
Completely.
Quietly. And before long, every path I traced, every falsified signature, every suspicious record, every conveniently redirected question began circling back toward the same two men I had once believed were my family, my husband and his son. There is a specific kind of betrayal that does not feel like heartbreak at first. It feels like contamination. Heartbreak is emotional, human, messy. It cries, it bargains, it still wants an answer. Contamination is colder than that. It is the moment you realize something unclean has been moving through the center of your life for years, touching everything, leaving residue on every memory you once considered safe. For 3 months, I investigated without saying a word. I went to work. I operated. I scrubbed in, scrubbed out, dictated notes, attended meetings, signed charts, answered residents' questions, reviewed trauma protocols, and came home each night to a husband who asked whether I wanted tea, and a stepson who still dropped by often enough to maintain the illusion of familial normalcy. I smiled when necessary. I listened. I observed. And all the while, I was building a second life beneath the first one. A hidden one, made of records, footage, timestamps, financial trails, and names people had hoped would stay buried. Surgeons are taught that hesitation can kill, but so can speed. The right move is rarely the fastest one. It is the most informed one. So, I became methodical. I requested archived access logs under the pretext of preparing for a departmental compliance review. I cross-checked operating room schedules against badge entries, chart timestamps, nursing notes, and my own calendar history. I pulled travel confirmations from old email folders, hotel receipts, conference registrations, boarding passes, vacation photos with metadata still attached. I mapped my absences. Then I mapped the procedures performed in my name during those absences. The overlap was not occasional. It was systematic. Once I saw the pattern clearly, the rest of it began unfolding with a kind of hideous logic. The surgeries logged under my credentials were not all high risk. That would have attracted attention too quickly. Many were routine procedures, appendectomies, gallbladders, orthopedic repairs, cases easy enough to hide in volume, easy enough to bury under assumptions, easy enough for administrators to smooth over when complications arose. But hidden inside those ordinary cases were disasters, botched closures, post-op infections linked to poor technique, internal bleeding that should have been recognized sooner, a spinal procedure that never should have been attempted by anyone lacking advanced surgical privileges, a woman in her 50s who lost kidney function after a preventable error, a young father who developed sepsis after a procedure that had been documented as uneventful. 3 deaths. 3 families who had buried someone while my name sat on the paperwork like a stain no one had yet forced into the light. At first, I still tried to imagine another explanation, not because the evidence was weak, because the truth was obscene. There is a limit to what the mind wants to accept about people it has loved. Even when the proof is sitting in front of you, some private, humiliated part of you keeps begging for a less catastrophic interpretation. Maybe Richard had been careless, not malicious. Maybe Derek had cut corners, not committed crimes. Maybe there was one desperate mistake, followed by an even worse cover-up. Maybe this was corruption born of panic. Maybe it wasn't the thing it so obviously was. Then I found Derek's board history. Failed once. Failed twice. Never fully licensed for independent surgery. And yet, there he was, embedded all through the records, visible not by name on official charts, but everywhere else, around the edges. Internal scheduling messages, unofficial note fragments, nursing complaints that had been softened before reaching compliance review, mentions of Dr. Mercer's family assisting, strange allowances, quiet exceptions, permissions that should never have existed. He had been operating anyway, not shadowing, not observing.
Operating.
Using my credentials as cover. The moment that truth settled into place, I felt something inside me go utterly still. Derek had always carried himself like someone impatient with the pace of merit. I saw that now in retrospect, with brutal clarity. He did not want to earn authority. He wanted access to it. The title, the respect. The room full of people stepping aside because they believed he belonged there. And Richard had built the road for him. His administrative access explained the chart adjustments, the buried complaints, the pressure points inside the system. He knew exactly where oversight was weakest, exactly which incidents could be relabeled, exactly how to redirect settlement money without creating a visible rupture. He had not simply protected his son. He had engineered a private operating channel inside a legitimate hospital and used my name as the skin stretched over it. I remember sitting in my office after midnight one evening, staring at a cluster of copied records spread across my desk, and realizing with a wave of nausea that this had likely been happening for years. Not weeks, not months. Years. While I slept beside him. While I hosted holidays. While I signed birthday cards for Derek and asked him polite questions over dinner about his future. The degradation of trust is rarely dramatic in the instant it happens. It is cumulative, archaeological. You go back through old memories with new information and watch them rot in your hands. Suddenly, every kindness looks strategic. Every omission looks deliberate. Every ordinary domestic moment becomes suspect. I started remembering things I had dismissed at the time. Richard asking for easier access to our shared home network because hospital files synced more efficiently that way. Derek's occasional questions about credentialing systems, phrased casually enough to sound like curiosity. Richard telling me once, years earlier, that my passwords were too complicated and I should use family-shared security software so I wouldn't lock myself out while traveling. At the time, it had sounded practical. In retrospect, it sounded like reconnaissance. The first nurse I spoke to did so only after I promised her I was not gathering gossip. I was gathering evidence. Her name was Talia. She had worked post-op for 8 years and had the cautious eyes of someone who had learned exactly how dangerous honesty could become in the wrong institution. We met in a coffee shop 40 minutes from the hospital, at a table near the back where the music was loud enough to swallow names if either of us slipped and said one. At first, she tried to protect herself with vagueness. Then I showed her a copied record from a procedure logged under my name on a date I had been in Lisbon. Her face changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Not surprise.
Recognition.
I knew something was wrong, she said quietly, fingers tightening around her cup. Not everything. Not like this. But enough. She told me Derek had been in operating rooms he had no business leading, that some nurses questioned it, but Richard had a way of making dissent sound like incompetence. If someone reported concerns, suddenly their schedules changed, their evaluations dipped, their requests disappeared into administrative silence. He never had to threaten people directly. Men like Richard rarely do. They build atmospheres where fear becomes self-sustaining. According to Talia, Derek performed best when the cases were simple and heavily supervised by assumption. But once, after hours or in rooms where oversight was lax, he overreached. He chased the authority he had not earned, and when things went wrong, the paperwork closed around my name. I asked how many people knew. She looked at me for a long time before answering. Enough to suspect, she said. Not enough to prove. and no one wanted to be the first one standing alone. That sentence stayed with me. No one wanted to be the first one standing alone. It explained more than hospital politics. It explained marriages, families, systems. The entire architecture of silence depends on convincing each frightened person that isolation is inevitable. So I made sure I would not stand alone when the time came. Over the following weeks, I spoke to 3 more nurses, 1 surgical tech, and a billing administrator who had quietly flagged irregular settlements months earlier, before being told the files were above her pay grade. None of them understood the full scope individually, but together, their statements formed connective tissue around the core evidence. Richard buried complications. Richard redirected internal reviews. Richard pushed settlements through unusual channels. Richard made sure families were paid before they grew loud enough to attract scrutiny. And Derek kept operating. One night, while Richard showered upstairs, I stood in his study with the desk drawer open and found a folder I had not known existed. Neat tabbed sections. Too neat. Inside were private settlement summaries, attorney correspondence, and a spreadsheet with coded notes that only became legible when placed next to the patient records I had already copied. Case numbers.
Amounts.
Disposition notes. One line read, VM file preserved / external narrative stable. My initials, not my name, not my identity.
Annotation. A usable asset.
I do not think I have ever felt rage that pure before or since. Not the hot kind. Not the kind that makes people throw things or scream until their throats hurt. Mine was cleaner.
Sharper.
It moved through me like a blade being honed. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it. Then I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection until my face stopped looking like someone else's. After that, the emotional question was no longer whether Richard and Derek had done it. The question became how thoroughly I needed to cut to survive what they had made of my life. If I went to hospital leadership too early, Richard could manage the narrative. He had been managing narratives for years. If I confronted him at home, I would warn him before the case was protected. If I went to the police with partial evidence, this could still become a domestic dispute between a powerful administrator and his overwrought surgeon wife. I knew exactly how easily institutions let credible women become inconvenient women the moment male power feels cornered. So I kept building. I consulted an attorney under privilege, then a second one. Because when the disease is this invasive, you do not rely on a single opinion. I contacted the medical board through confidential counsel, the state licensing authority, an investigator with healthcare fraud experience. I gave them pieces first, enough to establish seriousness, not enough to trigger movement before I was ready. Each time, I said the same thing. Wait, let me finish assembling the chart. By then, I knew 11 malpractice cases had been concealed under the machinery Richard controlled. 11. Not abstractly, not as a statistic. 11 individual human beings who had trusted a system that had used my face, my reputation, and my credentials as anesthesia. 3 of them were dead. I stopped sleeping properly after that, not because I doubted what I had to do, because every hour beside Richard became grotesque theater. He still reached for me in bed, still asked whether I wanted him to warm up the car on cold mornings, still texted me things like, "Don't forget dinner Friday with the donors," and "Proud of you today, beautiful." After hearing from someone that a procedure of mine had gone well, I would look at those messages and wonder whether he believed his own performance, whether there was any private chamber left inside him capable of shame. Derek called me one Sunday afternoon while I was reviewing copied records at the dining room table. "Hey, Viv," he said, with that same practiced ease. "Dad said you might be free next week. Thought maybe we could do lunch." Viv. He had called me that since he was 23, as though affectionate informality could erase the age difference, the hierarchy, the basic fact that he had never once truly respected me enough to leave my life untouched. I said I was busy. He laughed lightly. "You're always busy." There was something in that sentence. Something smug beneath the joke. You're always busy. Busy enough not to notice. Busy enough to be useful. Busy enough to make a perfect shield. After we hung up, I sat very still for a long time. That was the moment, more than any spreadsheet or case file, when the last emotional thread snapped. Because betrayal by a husband can still tempt you into private grief. Betrayal by a younger man who used your labor, your name, and your excellence as a shortcut to power strips even grief of its softness. What remained was purpose. I chose Richard's birthday carefully. 2 weeks away. Enough time to finish. Enough time to move essential belongings out of the house piece by piece without attracting suspicion. A suitcase to my office, important documents to a safety box, jewelry I actually cared about to a locked drawer at the hospital, a few clothes to a discreet hotel under another name, medication, passport, cash. I moved through my own home like a ghost rehearsing an exit. Meanwhile, my case hardened. By the final week, I had copied every falsified record I could access, secured footage proving I had been elsewhere during multiple surgeries performed under my credentials, documented the money trail behind buried settlements, collected witness statements, and handed over enough evidence to make denial structurally impossible. All that remained was timing. Richard thought we were planning a quiet birthday dinner at home. He kissed me goodbye that morning and thanked me, smiling, for keeping things simple this year. I smiled back. By then, I had already filed the divorce papers. By then, the documentation packets were in motion. By then, the surgery was scheduled. And for the first time in months, I no longer felt contaminated. I felt ready. The morning of Richard's birthday began like any other. That was intentional. He woke before me for once, moving through the bedroom with that quiet efficiency he reserved for days he considered important. There was a kind of satisfaction in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. He believed the day belonged to him. I watched him from the edge of sleep, memorizing the ease in his expression. It would not survive the evening. "Dinner at 7?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. "7's fine," I said. He turned, smiled, and crossed the room to kiss my forehead. It was a familiar gesture, predictable, practiced, the kind of gesture that, in a different life, might have meant something steady and safe. "Don't work too late," he added. "It's my birthday. I'd like to see my wife before midnight." Wife. The word landed with a strange, hollow neutrality. "I'll be there," I said. That was not a lie. I just wouldn't be staying. At 9:12 a.m., I signed the final divorce paperwork in my attorney's office. No dramatics, no hesitation, just ink on paper. A clean, decisive movement. Years of marriage reduced to a set of legal dissolutions, each one phrased in language that sounded almost polite compared to what had actually been done. At 11:40 a.m., the medical board received the full documentation package, 847 pages. Every falsified record, every discrepancy, every timeline cross-reference that proved not just error, but impossibility, not negligence. Fraud. At 2:15 p.m., the state licensing authority confirmed receipt. At 3:30 p.m., law enforcement was briefed. At 4:05 p.m., I checked into a hotel 20 minutes from the house I had lived in for nearly a decade. I placed my suitcase on the bed, set my phone on the nightstand, and sat down for a moment in the quiet, listening to the unfamiliar stillness of a room that held no history. There is a moment before a major surgery when everything is prepared, every instrument laid out, every contingency accounted for, and all that remains is the first incision. That moment is not chaotic. It is calm. I felt that same calm then. Not relief. Not fear. Just precision. At 5:42 p.m., Richard called. I let it ring. At 5:44, he called again. At 5:46, Derek called. I let that ring too. By 6:10, my phone screen was a steady pulse of incoming calls and messages. "Where are you? Are you on your way? Vivian, this isn't funny." Then, "We have a problem." That message came from Richard at 6:17. I read it once. I did not respond. At 6:32 p.m., the first voicemail came in. His voice was tight, controlled in that deliberate way he used when he was trying not to sound alarmed. "Vivian, call me back. There are people here asking questions. I don't know what this is, but we need to handle it carefully. Just call me. By 6:48 p.m., the control was cracking. What did you do? He said in the second message, the words sharper now, stripped of their polish. They're saying things that don't make any sense. They're talking about records, about procedures. Vivian, this is serious. If this is some kind of mistake, you need to fix it. Fix it. The reflex was almost admirable. Even now, faced with collapse, he assumed I was still part of the mechanism designed to protect him. At 7:03 p.m., Derek left his first message. Hey, I don't know what's going on, but Dad said you might know something. There are cops here. Actual cops. This isn't funny. Call us. Please. The words sounded foreign in his mouth. By 7:15, the calls were coming every few minutes. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, listening to them accumulate. Confusion gave way to anger. Anger sharpened into accusation. You've lost your mind, Richard snapped in one message. Do you have any idea what you've done? You're making yourself look guilty. Then bargaining. Whatever this is, we can explain it. There's context you don't understand. Derek was helping. We were protecting the hospital. This isn't what it looks like. And finally, at 2:04 a.m., long after I had turned off the lights and lay in the dark, staring at a ceiling that did not belong to my past, the last voicemail came through. His voice was different then. Lower. Afraid.
Psst.
Vivian, he said. And for the first time in nearly 10 years, he sounded uncertain. You don't understand what you've destroyed. Everything we built. It's gone. Just call me back, please. We can fix this. We can fix it. There was a pause. Then, softer. Don't do this. I deleted the message. Then I powered off my phone, and I slept. The arrests were confirmed the next morning. Richard was taken into custody at the house. Derek at his apartment across the city. The charges were not immediate convictions, of course. The system does not move that quickly. But the weight of the evidence ensured one thing immediately. Control had shifted. For years, Richard had controlled the narrative. Now, the narrative was documented. And documentation is a language institutions cannot easily ignore. The investigation lasted 14 months. I cooperated fully. I gave testimony. I answered questions from investigators, attorneys, regulatory boards, and review panels. I walked them through timelines, explained surgical protocols, clarified what should have happened versus what had been falsified. I did it all with the same clarity I bring to an operating room. No embellishment, no emotion, just fact. Richard lost his position within 6 weeks. Not quietly. Not gracefully.
Systematically.
His name was removed from internal leadership directories. His access revoked. His portrait taken down from the administrative wing. Years of cultivated reputation dismantled piece by piece. Each removal another confirmation that influence without integrity has no structural support once exposed. He tried initially to fight, to suggest misinterpretation, to imply I had misunderstood internal processes, to hint, subtly at first, then more directly, that I had been aware of Derek's involvement. That collapsed quickly, because I had not simply denied involvement. I had proven absence.
Time-stamped.
Verified.
Irrefutable.
Derek's case was slower, more complex. There is something particularly grim about watching someone who once carried himself with casual arrogance forced to sit in a courtroom while his competence is dissected in public record, practicing medicine without a license.
Fraud.
Negligent homicide. His defense argued, predictably, he had been pressured.
Misled. Influenced by his father.
He believed the arrangements were legitimate. He was young,
Inexperienced.
a victim in his own way. The jury did not agree. Evidence does not bend for narrative when it is thorough enough. He had operated,
Repeatedly. Knowingly.
and people had died. He received 12 years. Richard received 8. I was not in the courtroom when the sentences were read. I did not need to be. Closure for me had never been about watching consequences unfold. It had been about ensuring they could. The divorce finalized 3 months after the arrests. Richard attempted one last strategy through his attorney.
Complicity.
He argued that no surgeon could remain unaware of procedures performed under her own credentials, that my ignorance was implausible, that my silence before I acted suggested participation. It was a logical argument on the surface, but logic without evidence is just theory, and I had evidence, not just of what had been done, but of where I had been. Every conflicting timestamp, every travel record, every corroborated absence. I had not merely proven innocence. I had proven impossibility. The claim collapsed.
Completely.
I kept my license. I kept my reputation. I kept everything I had earned through 20 years of work that had nothing to do with them. The medical board issued a public statement clearing me entirely. Colleagues reached out, some with support, some with apologies for not seeing what had been happening sooner. I accepted both with the same quiet neutrality. They had not known. Neither had I. That was the point. That was how it had worked. People often expect a moment of emotional release after something like that. Tears, anger, some visible reaction that signals the end of suffering. I did not have one. What I felt instead was something much quieter, a kind of internal silence, not emptiness.
Absence.
Like a room that had been cleared of everything unnecessary. Some surgeries require follow-up, monitoring,
Adjustment.
but some, the clean ones, require nothing but closure. I closed. I left Boston 6 months after the divorce. Not because I had to. That's the part people never quite understand. My reputation was intact, my license was untouched, my position at the hospital was still secure, even strengthened in some ways by the investigation. I had become, in the eyes of many, a symbol of professional integrity under pressure. I could have stayed. I could have rebuilt my life exactly where it had been dismantled, but every hallway in that hospital held echoes. Every operating room carried a shadow of procedures I had never performed, but had nearly been blamed for. Every familiar face came with an unspoken question, not suspicion,
Curiosity.
and I had no interest in living inside other people's attempts to understand something that had already been resolved for me. Healing, like surgery, sometimes requires a change of environment, fresh air, clean space.
Distance from contamination.
So I accepted a position in Geneva, a hospital that knew my credentials, my outcomes, my publications, but not my story. That was important. I did not want to be known as the woman who exposed her husband. I wanted to be known as the surgeon who never should have had to. The transition was not dramatic. No grand farewell. No emotional send-off. I packed what remained of my life into a series of carefully labeled boxes, shipped what mattered, discarded what didn't, and boarded a flight that felt less like escape and more like completion. When I arrived, the city greeted me with quiet order, water that reflected light like polished glass, streets that did not carry my past, colleagues who evaluated me based on skill, not narrative. For the first time in years, I existed in a space that required nothing from me except competence. It was clean. I built a new life, the way I had dismantled the old one, methodically, without spectacle. Within a year, I was leading a trauma unit. Within 2, I was overseeing a department of 32 surgeons from 6 different countries, training residents who had never heard the name Richard Mercer and did not need to. I published research. I revised protocols. I operated.
Constantly.
Not to prove anything, but because this was always the center of who I was. Not the marriage, not the betrayal. The work, the precision, the moment where a life balanced on a knife's edge, and you either had the skill to pull it back, or you didn't. I did. And I still do. The apartment I chose overlooked the lake. Not large, not extravagant, but deliberate.
Minimal. Controlled.
There was a quiet satisfaction in building a space that contained only what I allowed into it. A desk, a shelf of surgical texts, a chair by the window, and a cat I adopted 6 weeks after I moved. I named him Suture. He sleeps on my journals, as if he understands that everything important in my life is written in margins and margins alone. The first attempt to reach me came 2 years after I relocated. An email from Derek, sent through a prison system address. The subject line read, "I need you to understand." I deleted it without opening it. Understanding was no longer a currency I traded in. 6 months later, another attempt. A letter from Richard, forwarded through multiple addresses before it reached my attorney. He wanted me to testify for his appeal. He wanted me to confirm, carefully, strategically, that I had been aware of some of Derek's procedures, that I had, in some indirect way, approved them. He wanted to reduce his sentence. He wanted access to my credibility. My answer was brief.
Clinical.
My attorney returned the letter unopened, with a single statement. Dr. Mercer has no further involvement in this matter. The third attempt came last year. Derek had been released early for good behavior. He had, apparently, tried to rebuild his life. Failed. No license. No hospital would touch him. No institution willing to absorb the liability of what his name now carried. He found me through LinkedIn. The message was carefully written, polished, measured. Dr. Mercer, I know you probably won't read this, but I want you to know that I've changed. I've done the work. I understand now what we did to you was wrong. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want a chance to show you who I've become. I'm trying to transition into healthcare administration. Even a neutral reference from you would make a difference. I'd be grateful for any help. I read it once, then I read it again. Not because I was moved, because I was assessing. The language was correct. The tone was controlled. The acknowledgement of harm was present, but beneath all of it was a request, carefully buried, like a surgical instrument hidden beneath gauze. He wasn't reaching out because he had changed. He was reaching out because he needed something.
Access.
Validation. My name. My reputation. The very thing he had used once before, without permission. Only this time, he was asking. That was the only difference. I deleted the message, blocked his profile, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just the quiet confirmation of a completed procedure. People have opinions about that. They always do. Some say everyone deserves a second chance. Some say he was young.
Influenced.
That prison was punishment enough. That rehabilitation should be encouraged. They might even be right. But that is not my responsibility. My responsibility is not to repair the people who broke something inside my life. My responsibility is to ensure that what I protect now remains intact. Derek made his choices, not once, not under pressure.
Repeatedly.
Every time he stepped into an operating room, he was not qualified to lead. Every time a patient trusted him based on credentials that belonged to me. Every time something went wrong, and he allowed my name to absorb the damage. 3 people died. 11 were seriously harmed. Families were altered permanently. That is not a mistake. That is a pattern. I do not hate him. Hatred is inefficient. It consumes energy without producing anything useful. In medicine, we call that an inflammatory response. Left unchecked, it damages healthy tissue. So, I removed it.
Completely.
What remains is something simpler.
Detachment.
The same emotional neutrality I bring to examining tissue once it has been excised from a body. It existed. It caused harm. It has been removed. It no longer requires engagement. Last month, I performed a surgery on a 6-year-old girl with a ruptured spleen after a car accident. 40 minutes.
Controlled. Precise.
When I told her parents she would recover completely, her mother collapsed into her husband's arms and cried in a way that sounded like something breaking open and healing at the same time. That is why I became a surgeon. Not for titles, not for recognition, for that moment, that outcome, that second chance. Richard and Derek tried to turn that into something else.
A cover. A shield.
A mechanism for greed and incompetence. They almost succeeded. But almost is not the same as complete. I am still here, still operating, still saving lives, with hands that are clean, because I chose to expose what was happening instead of protecting the people doing it. If you are reading this and you recognize something, a situation where your name, your work, Your trust is being used without your consent. Understand this. You are not obligated to protect people who exploit you. You are not required to remain silent when harm is being done in your name. And you are not responsible for the consequences that follow when truth replaces illusion. Document it. Expose it. Remove it. Then heal. The body knows how. It always has. Given the chance, it will rebuild. Stronger. Cleaner. More resilient than before. I am 49 now. I lead one of the most respected trauma departments in Europe. I have a life that belongs entirely to me. No hidden systems. No quiet corruption. No compromises made for the sake of someone else's ambition. This is not a story about survival. It is a story about precision, about recognizing disease, removing it completely, and continuing forward without it. That is not tragedy. That is a successful outcome. The prognosis is excellent.